Okay. So thank you very much for including me, Yahweh. Greetings, everybody. I wanted to thank Scano and the Syracuse University and everybody here for putting together such an interesting panel and for inviting me to participate. Right now, I'm a professor of anthropology at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania, and my contact information is at the bottom of your screen there. I also wanted to say that I'm speaking from New Jersey, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape. So I am today going to be talking about a piece of some research that's looking at how the Sullivan-Clinton expedition has been commemorated. I want to start by saying a little bit about myself, though, first. I'm a cultural anthropologist who looks at memory and forgetting, and I'm especially interested in the role of the past in helping to legitimize dominant groups and help them hold on to their power. So my first study was actually with French settlers of Algeria, and I was interested in how people who fled the colony at decolonization in the 60s looked back at the colonial past and how they reframed it for their own interests in the present. And so I'm now working on a new project that's looking at a similar topic. It's how Euro-Americans have been commemorating a piece of their history, the Sullivan Expedition, what is called the Sullivan Expedition in Pennsylvania, what's called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign in New York. And I'm interested in why people commemorated it, how they've commemorated it, and what kind of stories they're telling themselves by commemorating it. And I'm interested in how Euro-Americans place markers on the land that tell a certain story, and how in doing so, they're also hiding other stories. So what I'm going to work on today is basically the 1929 stone markers that people can see across central New York. There are about 35 that have been established. They were followed by the gold and the blue signs that Dr. Mount Pleasant just mentioned that were established in the 30s. And so I'm interested in asking who set up these markers in New York and why, and what was the motivation. So most of these markers were established during a sesquicentennial celebration. I want to just give you an overview to tell you where we're headed here. So I'm looking at how Sullivan-Clinton is kind of invented. It's invented as something to commemorate at a certain time. And, you know, you might say, well, at the time, people were crazy about the Revolutionary War. This was an anniversary. Maybe New Yorkers were especially patriotic, or maybe something else is going on. The other point that I want to bring up is I'll be looking at how state officials try to invite Haudenosaunee to participate in their festivities and their parades and their marker dedications and the pageant, but are rejected. Why? And what I'll be saying is that there's an interesting coincidence of two things going on at once that I think are related. So one is the invention of the Sullivan-Clinton tradition, and the other is a stretch of Haudenosaunee activism that really picks up into a land claims movement that is threatening sovereignty in a lot of New York State. So I'm going to be talking about the relationship of these two things. So the 1929 festivities were part of New York's celebration of the Revolutionary War. And New York was not alone. As cities and states started to approach, you know, the signing of the Declaration, the 150th anniversary, they had huge events. So for instance, in Philly, there was a huge programming. Other states had programming. And so in New York, people started thinking about this in the 20s, early 20s. This program was placed under the education department, and it was directed by a man named Alexander Flick, who was the state historian. So you're going to hear a lot about Flick now. He chaired a committee that first tried to decide what events to celebrate for New York's Revolutionary War sesquicentennial. So they sent out surveys, and surveys came back with 640 different events people thought should be celebrated. And they set about putting together pageants around the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the creation of a New York Constitution, the Battle of Long Island, and so forth. Among these 640 events, Sullivan and Clinton barely featured. It was not really a focus. And they even put together a big book about the Revolutionary War in New York, and it's only mentioned in a couple lines in that whole book. So the Sullivan Expedition is not a focus at first until they run out of funding at the end of 1927. And so at this point, Flick proposes to the state to give more money to carry out a celebration of Sullivan and Clinton. And he's argued that the Sullivan and Clinton was attractive to celebrate because it covered so much ground. It included 20 or more counties, and so you could have more area in which to engage in public history making. And at the time, people thought that engaging children in this kind of public history making around the Revolutionary War would turn them into better citizens and so forth. And so he gave speeches across the state to kind of bring people up to speed. And when you read the speeches, you can see he's taking a defensive position because for many non-native New Yorkers, Sullivan was still a kind of distasteful, there was kind of a distasteful feeling about what the soldiers had done. And we've heard a great deal with the previous presentations about exactly what this involved. So Flick is countering this kind of distaste, and he's trying to drum up support. Ooh, this slide got messed up. But anyway, what this slide is telling us is that his first task was to kind of rebrand it. So he invents something called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. He writes in some of his materials that this was part of Washington's Indian expedition. And the Indian expedition was then renamed as the Sullivan Expedition, and that was the name that it was known for a long time. He says in his statement to the Board of Regents and so forth that it should be called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, not expedition, because it was larger. And he thought that we should include Clinton because he was second in command. What is interesting is that Clinton was one of several generals of the same status from different states. And so that's what's in the tiny little letters here. Maxwell was leading a brigade from New Jersey. Poor was leading a brigade from New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And Han was leading a brigade from Pennsylvania. And you can see already by calling this Sullivan-Clinton campaign, they're bringing in Clinton, you know, part of sort of New York royalty, so to speak, and dismissing the participation of generals from other states. So it kind of constructs this as a more New York focused element of the Revolutionary War. Okay. And you can even see this depicted in some of the plaques. So Pennsylvania also put up sesquicentennial plaques, but they call it the Sullivan Expedition. Okay. But even with this new name, it's unclear what you're going to celebrate. You know, what are you going to celebrate? What was really wanton destruction that would be probably labeled genocidal today? So early news stories show how he wasn't really sure what to do. So one of the first ideas was to have people march around the state exactly where the troops had gone, which for many people would have been seen as very threatening. And then they quickly calculated this would take way too long. And then they thought about buses and busing troops around, and then he thought that would mar the effect. When he spoke to the Livingston County Historical Society, he said the celebration was not going to be for the commemoration of a military victory, but more for its significance afterwards. He said he didn't want to celebrate destruction, but he wanted to see an Indian village built with true models of Indian homes, growing crops, and even domestic animals, if they should be found practical. He made a pitch for the people of Elmira that they were going to have an all-out reenactment of the Battle of Newtown. And he said that local Indians were going to play a role in his language. This is what he said. The battle will be enacted in full costume, and arrangements are now being made with the Iroquois Indians on the state reservations to take part, representing their forefathers who fought under Joseph Brant. In the end, several of these plans never transpired. And what he ended up doing was mostly organizing a series of historical marker dedications. with local communities bearing half the cost. And you can see there was also a big pageant. So the marker dedications, here's a dedication of a marker in Elmira in 1929. And then they have this massive pageant that's put on in 3 different locations in September of 1929. But what I want to talk about now is how his, one of his elements, one of the ways he defended this program was by including Haudenosaunee participants. And so when he first outlined his plans for the Board of Regents, they said, the meaning is not to gloat or revive old hatred. And so for that reason, they're quarterly going to invite representatives of Canada, Great Britain, and the Iroquois to take part. They don't outline exactly how they're going to take part. And when I go through some of these ideas, you can think about how Flick really had a difficulty understanding how this would be viewed from a Haudenosaunee perspective. What he did is he reached out to many Haudenosaunee leaders, inviting them. So here's a letter that he sent to a Seneca leader saying, we want to establish a beautiful monument. In this case, they wanted to put a monument on the Allegheny territory. Would you consent to take part in this ceremony? So he sent out lots of letters like this. And for the most part, people just did not respond. So I think I've given you enough time to take a look at that. So you might say, not responding is already an active choice and is a form of resistance. There's something else going on at the time too. And so to really understand that, we have to go back in time a little bit, because the early 1920s was this era of incredible activism, and especially about a land claims movement. And in fact, if you go back to this time period, you might even see the entire Sullivan-Clinton extravaganza as an elaborate colonizer attempt to respond to this activism, right? Okay. So here's headlines. This is when the news kind of first breaks. Is white man's title to more than 6 million acres of one-time Indian land in New York State threatened? 1922. So the activism that I was mentioning, protesting the imposition of citizenship, condemning the conscription of non-citizen Indians in New York in World War I, that sort of thing. So there was a lot going on, but the real challenge was a major land claim issue. Okay. This was brought up after the conclusion of a commission. So there was a New York commission that was created after U.S. District Court voted to return land to an Oneida family in 1920. And they were stating that New York courts couldn't remove the Oneidas as they were a federally recognized tribe. This case revealed jurisdictional confusion. So the New York legislature had created a commission to determine once and for all whether the 6 nations of New York were under federal or state control. So they create a commission, and the man who ends up chairing it is a man named Edward Everett. Edward Everett holds hearings at every single 6 Nation reservation in New York. He goes to Ontario as well. And he is schooled by local Haudenosaunee leaders about federal treaties, and some of the treaties we just heard from Dr. Mount Pleasant. Let me just move ahead. So he especially hears about the Fort Stanwix Treaty, but also the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, which mandates a federal agent, Indian consent, ratification by the Senate, and a presidential signature in order to purchase Indian land according to the act, in the language of the act, and also the Treaty of Canandaigua that we just heard about. And he starts to realize that despite these federal treaties, New York State speculators that we also heard about just now, and political leaders made dozens of fraudulent land disposition agreements with distinct Haudenosaunee nations. And he concludes that New York State rests on an unstable legal foundation. These conclusions were radical. He determined that they, 6 nations have title to lands estimated about 6 million acres. And that's the source of that headline I mentioned before. When he presents this to the legislature, his other commission members don't sign his report. The report is never disseminated more widely. and only one copy remained in the archives and was kind of lost for a while. But he had already released his findings to the Haudenosaunee leaders that he had consulted with earlier. And so Haudenosaunee began traveling to Onondaga, where they were gathering to plan a legal strategy, and New York presses were noticing. This one's pretty straightforward. Indians claim half of New York. Okay. Other presses say things like, the Six Nations are out on the warpath, not with tomahawks and sharp-pointed arrows for the heart of an enemy, but with lawyers and ancient records. The Buffalo Courier announces in 1925, land on which Buffalo is situated is sought by tribes of 6 Iroquois nations. So it's at this time, when the future of much of the state is possibly at stake, that the state historian is planning a statewide celebration of Sullivan-Clinton. And so what happens here, so I just have this slide here to kind of depict the Everett report is released in 1922. Then you have the state starting to plan the Revolutionary War ceremonies. The Haudenosaunee are gathering in Onondaga, and they file their first case in 1925. This is going to be the initial of several different land claims cases. And the first case was against a power company that occupied land that belonged to the Mohawk Nation. Now, right away, the New York State Attorney moved to dismiss the case on the grounds that the Haudenosaunee were now, because of the Indian Citizenship Act, citizens of the United States, and they were just submitting the case to the wrong courts. But there were appeals right away. So then if you take a look at this graph, you can see that when Sullivan-Clinton commemorations are approved, this case is still in appeal. And even when they're contacting Haudenosaunee leaders, asking them to take part, it's unclear where this case is going to fall. The appeals are only finally exhausted in May 1929. This is well after the markers are already starting to go up across New York State. Okay, so that's kind of the coincidence and timing that I wanted to get across. I'll go back to our story. So while the appeals are still waiting and we're not sure what's going to happen with the land, the state historian is tired of not hearing back from Haudenosaunee about participating in his various marker dedications. So they decide to go meet with a group of Haudenosaunee that are meeting for a totally different purpose in February of 1929. And it's at this meeting that they get a great rebuff. So there's incredible, like, just outright rejection of participating in these programs. What they did is they attended the meeting of the Cornell Indian Board. So I have to explain this group for a bit. The Cornell Indian Boards were a group of delegates from different Six Nations that would form, that would meet every year in February at Cornell to select students for short courses at Cornell. So this is an interesting part of New York history. This is a part of the agricultural extension program. Okay, so they would meet every year. And this is an image I have of 1921 gathering, and it has prominent Six Nation leaders, as you can see. Here are the people that are meeting in Cornell in February 1929. Now, there are also some Onondaga there, and the newspaper articles did not say who they were. So there you have a gathering of prominent people, and they're meeting together at the ending powwow. Basically, it seems that they were kind of broadsided by the state representative, who then approaches them at the powwow and says, hey, why don't you join us at we want to extend an official invitation to you to participate in our Sullivan-Clinton programming. The chair of the boards that year was Walter Boots Kennedy from Allegheny. And according to the Buffalo Evening News, he stood up or said to the state representatives, the Six Nations of the Iroquois did not feel that conditions warranted their participation in the Sullivan-Clinton program. He said this is because the white man has broken his part of the agreement. And he's speaking to Nelson, who is Flick's secretary, his designate. And he goes on then to bring up a topic that's a little bit different. Now, Kennedy had already testified at length at the Everett Commission years before, and he was described in the Cornell Daily Sun as a well-known orator and farmer. And his oratory skills received public recognition in the Buffalo Evening News. But he brings up a different kind of complaint, one that was unassailable. And he says that at the end of the war, they reserved different pieces of land for themselves, and one was for the burial places of their fathers, their ancestors. And he outlines the different counties of concern. He lists precisely Chautauqua, Wyoming, Livingston, and so forth. He explained that the Indians had the solemn promise of George Washington himself that these burial places would never be disturbed, that the white man would never molest the sleep of our fathers. And then he goes on to say that now white men have thrown out the bones of our fathers and they're bleaching in the sun and the snow at this moment. And we understand that they send their collections of arrowheads and copper beads to the graves, to your museum cases in Albany. Okay. And then, according to the paper, an Onondaga man added that his people had plans to dig up white men's cemeteries and scatter the bones around unless this careless practice is stopped. And Andrew Gibson, who was also there, apparently they all nodded in agreement. The next day, this group of leaders passed a resolution unanimously condemning the desecration of Indian graves, and they sent a copy to the New York State Legislature. So I find it really interesting that, first of all, this is an early articulation of Native views regarding the disturbance of burials, and it's sort of an interesting side story. But also, when invited to participate in parades and pageantry and marker dedications, most of the people contacted by mail responded with silence. But when finally forced into a public response at the closing powwow of the Cornell Indian Board's meeting on a totally different topic, the people present didn't bother to challenge the distasteful or boastful nature of the Sullivan-Clinton festivities. Instead, they used the occasion to raise a different topic of great concern. Okay. Now, there is another possible reason for this rebuff. I'm already suggesting that non-participation might have been partly because the land claims case that was pending. Also related is the way the Sullivan story is told in the pageant and on the plaques. So let's look at the plaques. So the marker text says simply this, and it talks about an expedition against the hostile Indian nations which checked the aggressions of the English on the frontiers, extending westward the Dominion of the United States. Okay. This account suggests that Sullivan-Clinton was the end of conflict with these hostile, so-called hostile Indian nations, check the aggressions. Also suggests that it's because of Sullivan-Clinton directly that the Dominion of the United States was extended. It makes it seem that Sullivan-Clinton made New York possible. The later marking out of different villages with the yellow and gold plaques also constructs a narrative of decline, and especially at a time when the trope of the vanishing Indian settler colonial fantasy was so pervasive. This declension narrative has been in place for a while, as we've seen. The monument text also assists in promoting outright falsehoods, because Haudenosaunee attacks after 1779 were more devastating than before. So Barbara Graymount has argued this. Native Americans who took part in many of these attacks, Corn Planter and others have argued this. So Barbara Graymount says that Washington's goals were to break the power of the Indian foe and make the frontier safe, but the expedition, in quotes, achieved neither of these goals. Instead, now the war became very personal. If they did not have a cause before, the Haudenosaunee now had one. And then Six Nation members returned the next spring to many locations, as we've heard from Dr. Mount Pleasant and as their work documents. So there's a lot of misinformation there with that first line. Historian Colwyn Calloway has recently calculated the number of houses and other things that were carried out after. So if you look at the bottom of this quote, he sort of tallies up after Sullivan-Clinton, after Haudenosaunee returned to different areas, they were able to mount even more attacks on the frontier settlements than before the Sullivan-Clinton raids. So you can see the last, he said it generated more, not fewer raids on American settlers. So that's the first two pieces of information. Then, as we've seen from Dr. Mount Pleasant and others, New York was still Indian country, says Beth Ryan, who found that Euro-American travelers in the Finger Lakes into the 19th century came across Native American on the roads everywhere. So what happened? Well, the Haudenosaunee homelands were obtained through various means, but often by speculators or political leaders who were often one and the same after Sullivan and Clinton. In one case, they were making dozens of land disposition agreements, often fraudulently without following the provisions of the 1790 federal treaties. Entrepreneurs and leading politicians openly conspired to obtain lands held by the Oneida and Cayugas, Onondagas, and Senecas to benefit from the transportation revolutions. And Larry Hauptman and others have really documented this well. So the markers promote a narrative of like so-called Iroquois, in quotes, decline, and this vanishing Indian fantasy that was so common of the time. And they also tell non-native New Yorkers that they owe their good fortune to Sullivan and Clinton. And so there's a lot of misinformation there. I want to just return finally to this question of timing. There's a synchronicity here that may not be a coincidence. So when I look at the timing of the land claims cases and the Sullivan-Clinton extravaganza, there are a few points to make. These events took place at a time of great Haudenosaunee activism and a possibly earth-shattering land claims case. Rather than seeing the Haudenosaunee responding to the state, we might want to reverse the kind of direction here and suggest that the state may be responding to the Haudenosaunee. We might see in the 1929 Sullivan-Clinton events a reaction to the lawsuit or an attempt to prevent future lawsuits. See, this is really our land, the plaques seem to be claiming. We really won this land fair and square. We won it in a military victory. You owe this land to Sullivan, is what the plaques seem to be telling New Yorkers. These plaques would cause some misunderstanding in the state, even into the 70s. When land claims cases were heating up again, there was a public hearing about a Cayuga negotiation underway in 1979. And a Waterloo supervisor just kind of blurted out, well, I thought when Clinton and his troops marched through here in the 1700s that the Indian problem was taken care of. So this suggests that the false story told in the plaques makes it seem as if the state exists due to Sullivan and that the local white or non-native peoples owe their good fortune to Sullivan and Clinton. And swept from view is decades of land swindles that state officials directed or condoned, which many high-ranking state leaders directly profited from. So we might see the 1929 monuments as an elaborate response, this patriotic fanfare, kind of a desperate attempt to claim land for the state, kind of acts of possession, at a time when the titles were very much in question. So that's what I want to say today. So I'm trying to show that even the markers that are around us may have had a political agenda underlying them that we should take into account. And thank you very much. I'll stop screen sharing now.